So I want to end this lecture by talking about the general kinds of criticisms that functionalism faces in the philosophical literature overall. Now, two general kinds of criticisms. The first criticism notes that functionalism is theory relative and that it defines individual mental terms in a holistic way, and it uses the meaning of those terms to determine whether or not something counts as an instance. As a result, what counts or doesn't count as an instance is very strongly determined by adhering exactly to the theory. So anything that varies from that theory, that functional organization, even a little bit, won't count. And that seems like it creates situations where functionalism is both too chauvinistic, that is, it rules some things out that shouldn't, and too liberal, that is, it allows things that maybe it shouldn't. The same thing is true when we look at that fixed functional organization and then we look at instances in the world and we say, okay, does this count? Does this count? Does this count? It seems difficult for functionalists to specify inputs and outputs and so on in such a way that they can rule out all the cases that don't seem to count and include all the cases that do. So in some ways, the very nature of the theory creates the difficulties that it faces. So I won't spell these arguments out in detail. I'll just talk about them schematically, since we'll run into most of them in troubles with functionalism. So what about this idea that functionalism is theory relative? Well, functionalism is a descriptivist account of mental states. It takes all the relationships in some particular theory, and then it uses those relationships to create a definite description that's supposed to pick out all and only the things that are the denotations of that term, the reference of that term. Now, since it's both descriptive and holistic, then we start to wonder, well, what happens if there's variability there? So, for instance, Lewis has a great paper called Mad Pain, Martian Pain. The idea is, suppose, you've got a sadomasochist. Suppose you've got someone who's just got a slightly different psychology. Do they feel pain now? Do they not feel pain? Is the pain different from ours? Functionalism seems to find those cases problematic, but you don't even have to do anything like refer to sadomasochism. You can just imagine, well, suppose people have additional senses. Suppose, I don't know, they've got extrasensory perception, say, or echolocation abilities. Anything that changes the basic functional organization of an individual now makes them a deviant relative to our standard human theory, and the question becomes, well, what should we do with that? Now, we can try introducing some flexibility into acceptable functional organizations, but if we introduce too much, we're going to become too liberal. We're going to start including things that don't look like they really have those mental states. If we tighten things up too much, we're going to be too chauvinistic. And so how do we strike that balance in our specification of what counts as an appropriate functional organization? So some criticisms turn on that Ramsey sentence part of our functionalist account, and they can create things that look like chauvinism on the part of functionalism or liberalism on the part of functionalism. The same thing is true when we look at that interpretation function. What counts as an instance of that functional organization, however we decide we want to specify it? If we're too conservative in what we say counts, we run the risk of being chauvinistic. If we're too liberal, if we're too open-minded about what counts as an instance of our functional organization, we run the risk of saying that things that don't have mental states do. So let's look at the case of chauvinism first. Oftentimes, functional specifiers are accused of chauvinism because they exhibit this anthropocentric neuroanatomy bias. You have to have brains like ours in order to have pain for somebody like Lewis. So lots of people think that no brain, no pain is just chauvinistic. If we really limit or narrow the interpretation function, we may exclude things that look for all the world like they experience pains or have beliefs. What if we open up that interpretation function and we start letting in a whole bunch of things? Well, then we start to run into cases where we have instances of our functional organization that just don't look very mental. So extreme examples of this are things like absent qualia, the Chinese nation that Bloch talks about. Other examples are questions about whether someone can have the same functional organization but different qualia. Those are the inverted qualia example. What about homunculi systems where part of the functionality is done by something that already has a mind? So all of these cases look like cases of liberalism, and they all turn around that interpretation function being very unconstrained.